At a military graduation ceremony, Laura Hensley sat quietly in the crowd, looking like any other proud mother. But when a Marine colonel spotted the hidden tattoo on her wrist, everything changed. This wasn't just any tattoo. It was a classified seal marking that officially didn't exist. Hit like if you want to know what happened next. Subscribe for more incredible stories, and comment where you're watching from. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Naval Air Technical Training Center's main auditorium, casting harsh shadows across rows of metal folding chairs. Laura Hensley sat 3 rows from the front, her weathered hands gripping an old digital camera like a lifeline. The ceremony hadn't even begun, and already she could feel the weight of 100 curious glances. "Excuse me?" The voice cut through the pre-ceremony chatter like a blade. Lieutenant Marcus Reddick leaned across the aisle, his pressed uniform pristine, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Ma'am, this is kind of a joke, right? That seat's reserved." Laura's fingers tightened around her camera. She'd checked the invitation twice, printed from the email her son had forwarded. Somewhere in this room, Tyler was graduating from Air Traffic Control School. Somewhere in this room, she belonged. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, measured and careful. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose. Around them, other attendees began to notice. Phones emerged from pockets. Conversations turned to whispers. Someone behind her actually giggled. "Should have picked up your badge at the front desk," Reddick said, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. His tone dripped with the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. Laura's right hand moved instinctively to adjust her sleeve, and for half a second, barely long enough to register, the edge of something dark showed against her wrist. Ink, lines, the shape of something that shouldn't exist. She pulled the fabric down quickly, but not before the camera caught it. Not before someone might have seen. The silence stretched between them, thick as summer humidity. Reddick's smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone cold, the kind of cold that said he'd already decided who she was, what she was worth, and exactly how this would end. Laura sat perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her posture straight. She'd learned long ago that the best defense was to become invisible, to let them see what they expected to see. A nervous mother, out of place, embarrassed by her own presence. But beneath her careful composure, something else stirred, something that remembered what it meant to hold ground. The corridor outside the auditorium buzzed with nervous energy. Laura stood near a water fountain, checking her camera for the 3rd time. Though the battery indicator hadn't changed, her purse sat heavy on her shoulder, and she couldn't stop her hands from moving, adjusting the strap, smoothing her jacket, touching the outside pocket where something small and round pressed against the fabric. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she turned toward the hangar visible through the corridor's windows. For a moment, she was somewhere else entirely, crouched beneath the belly of a transport helicopter, her hands sure and steady as they traced damaged wiring by feel alone. The memory lasted only seconds, but it left her breathless. "Not what you seem," she thought, the words rising unbidden. "You okay there?" Laura spun. An older man in dress blues stood a few feet away, his weathered face kind but curious. His nameplate read Brackett, and something in his eyes suggested he'd seen enough service to recognize it in others. "Just preparing for the ceremony," Laura managed. Owen Brackett nodded slowly, his gaze dropping for just a moment to her right wrist, where the sleeve had shifted again. This time, Laura didn't bother to adjust it. Something told her this man had already seen what he needed to see. She opened her purse to find a tissue, and her fingers brushed against cold metal. The challenge coin sat nestled behind her son's graduation paperwork, its surface worn smooth by years of being carried but never displayed. Echo 12. It read in small letters around the edge. Most people wouldn't know what that meant. Most people weren't supposed to. Owen's expression shifted, just barely, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of recognition, or at least the beginning of it. He pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then looked back at her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think you might want to stay close. Sometimes these ceremonies, they bring up old connections." Before Laura could ask what he meant, the sound of dress shoes on tile announced Lieutenant Reddick's approach. Owen melted back into the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned when to watch from the shadows. Laura's hand closed around the challenge coin, and for the first time in years, She wondered if carrying it had been a mistake. Back in the auditorium, the pre-ceremony atmosphere had shifted. Where before there had been casual chatter, now there were pointed looks and not quite whispered conversations. Laura found her seat again. Acutely aware that she'd become the entertainment, Lieutenant Reddick materialized beside her row like a predator scenting weakness. "You know what?" His voice carried just far enough to ensure an audience. "I'm going to make this easy for you. Admit you grabbed someone else's pass, and I'll handle this quietly. Nobody needs the drama." The offer hung in the air like a loaded weapon. All around them, phones appeared, some discreet, some not. Laura could feel the weight of dozens of stares, the electric anticipation of people waiting for a scene to unfold. She looked up at Reddick, this man who'd decided her fate based on nothing more than her shoes. Her camera, her obvious displacement in his world of pressed uniforms and earned privileges. The easy way out sat right there, wrapped in his smug certainty. "I won't lie," she said. The words came out steady, final, not loud but clear enough to reach the people recording, not defiant but absolutely certain. Reddick's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Really? That's the hill you want to die on?" Behind him, Laura caught sight of Owen Brackett near the back of the auditorium. He was typing on his phone again, his expression focused. As she watched, he showed the screen to another man in uniform, someone older. With the bearing of real authority, the second man's eyebrows rose and he immediately began typing on his own device. Laura's hands had started to shake, just slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs, feeling the outline of the challenge coin through her pocket. Whatever was happening, whatever Owen had set in motion, there was no going back now. The murmur of conversation around them was building, and she could hear the words security being passed from row to row, but underneath that, something else was building too, a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the lieutenant's threats. Someone, somewhere in this building, was making phone calls. Owen Brackett stood in the administrative corridor, his phone pressed to his ear while he watched maintenance staff hurry past with last-minute preparations. The person on the other end had gone quiet after Owen described what he'd seen. "Echo 12, Owen repeated quietly. "Black trident, coordinates underneath, I'm telling you. I've seen that symbol in classified briefs. Not the kind of thing someone just tattoos for fun." Through the phone's speaker, he could hear typing, database searches, the kind of careful verification that happened when someone stumbled across something that wasn't supposed to exist. Back in the auditorium, Laura sat perfectly still while the drama built around her. She'd stopped looking at Lieutenant Reddick entirely, focusing instead on the American flag hanging behind the podium. Her right hand moved almost unconsciously to her wrist, tracing the hidden lines of ink beneath the fabric. The tattoo artist in Norfolk had warned her it was dangerous. "Coordinates in a military tat," he'd said. "That's either the smartest thing you've ever done or the stupidest." She'd never told him which it was. Now, feeling the weight of scrutiny from every direction, she was beginning to suspect it had been both. A protocol officer appeared at the end of her row. Young, nervous, clearly following orders he didn't fully understand. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping into the corridor for a moment? There seems to be some confusion about seating." It was the easy way out. Offered again, a chance to disappear before whatever Owen had started reached its conclusion. Laura could feel the entire auditorium holding its breath, waiting to see if she'd take it. Instead, she shook her head. The protocol officer's radio crackled to life, a burst of static and urgent voices that made him step back into the aisle. Through the open doors at the rear of the auditorium, Laura could hear something she hadn't expected. The measured sound of military boots on tile, approaching fast. Someone important was coming, someone who might have answers to questions that had been classified for 15 years. The administrative office had transformed into a nerve center of quiet urgency. Owen Brackett stood near a window overlooking the parking lot, his phone pressed to his ear, while he watched late arrivals hurry toward the auditorium. The voice on the other end belonged to Master Chief Rodriguez at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, and what he was hearing made Owen's chest tighten with a mixture of vindication and concern. "Echo 12, Rodriguez repeated slowly, the sound of typing audible in the background. "Jesus, Owen, where did you see that designation?" "Tattoo," Owen replied quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure privacy. "Black trident, coordinates underneath. Woman at the graduation ceremony. Something about her didn't add up. Military bearing, situational awareness. But working as a maintenance tech. The typing stopped. Hold on. More silence then. I'm looking at classified files that I probably shouldn't be accessing without proper authorization. Echo 12 was real, Owen. Deep Black Operation 2009. Unit disbanded after Operation Warden 3. Owen felt his pulse quicken. What kind of operation? The kind where 18 people went in and 18 people came out. But officially nobody was ever there. Rodriguez's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Personnel extraction under hostile conditions complicated doesn't begin to cover it. Through the window, Owen could see the auditorium building where Lieutenant Reddick was presumably still making Laura Hensley's life miserable while she sat in that chair. Surrounded by whispers and pointed fingers, the woman who might have saved 18 lives while Owen was running convoy protection in Iraq. I need details, Owen said. Can't give you operational specifics, but I can tell you this. The communications specialist on that mission spent 16 hours rebuilding radio equipment under fire. Without that person, the extraction would have failed. Rodriguez paused. The whole unit received classified commendations, but public recognition was shelved due to ongoing security concerns in the region. Owen closed his eyes, thinking of Laura's careful posture, the way she'd automatically scanned the room for exits. The challenge coin he'd glimpsed in her purse. What happened to the personnel after disbandment? Scattered to the winds. Some stayed in special operations, others got out entirely. Most of the records were buried so deep that even routine veteran affairs couldn't access them. The sound of papers rustling came through the phone. Owen, if this woman really was part of Echo 12, she's been carrying that service alone for 15 years. No unit reunions, no official recognition, no support network, and probably no one believing her if she tried to explain, Owen added, thinking of all the ways civilian employers might react to unverifiable claims of classified service. Meanwhile, in the auditorium, Laura remained in her seat while the tension around her continued to build. She'd stopped trying to follow the pre-ceremony announcements, focusing instead on controlling her breathing and maintaining the composed facade that had carried her through 15 years of careful anonymity. Her right hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, tracing the hidden lines of the tattoo that was apparently causing so much activity behind the scenes. Tyler was supposed to be somewhere in the backstage area with his graduating class, preparing for the ceremony that would officially make him an air traffic controller. She'd driven 4 hours to be here for this moment, had requested time off from work, had even bought a new jacket for the occasion. The last thing she'd expected was to become the center of a drama that seemed to be escalating beyond her ability to control. The protocol officer, a young ensign who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, approached her row again, tablet in hand. This time his expression was different, less confident but more curious. Ma'am, he said quietly, there seems to be some confusion about your records. Would you mind stepping out to the corridor for a moment? Just to clarify some details. It was another lifeline, another opportunity to escape before whatever Owen had set in motion reached its conclusion. Laura could see other attendees watching the exchange, some recording with their phones, others whispering behind hands. She could walk away right now, drive home, and pretend this had never happened. Instead, she met the ensign's eyes steadily. What kind of details? The young officer glanced at his tablet, clearly uncomfortable. Well, there are some discrepancies in the guest registration system. Some missing information that might be relevant to your authorization to attend today's ceremony. Laura felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. 15 years of buried records were apparently not as buried as she'd believed. And if I refused to step out, ma'am, I'm not sure that would be advisable. Before Laura could respond, the sound of multiple footsteps echoed from the rear of the auditorium. Authoritative footsteps moving with purpose. She turned to see Captain Reeves entering through the main doors, followed by 2 other officers she didn't recognize, and a civilian in a suit who had the bearing of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. Lieutenant Reddick, who'd been holding court with a group of junior officers near the side wall, noticed the new arrivals immediately. His earlier confidence began to show cracks as he realized this situation had escalated far beyond his control. Back in the administrative office, Owen was finishing his conversation with Rodriguez while simultaneously researching contact information for higher-level officers who might have the authority to address this situation properly. "Master Chief, I need you to do me a favor," Owen said. "I need someone to verify this woman's service record through proper channels, someone with enough rank to make Lieutenant Reddick sit down and shut up." "Already on it," Rodriguez replied. "I'm reaching out to Colonel Coulter. He commanded the joint task force that coordinated Echo 12's extraction. If anyone can speak to this woman's service, it's him." Owen's eyebrows rose. "Coulter's still active. Marine Colonel, stationed at Quantico. And Owen, if he confirms what I think he's going to confirm, that lieutenant is about to have the worst day of his military career." Through the phone, Owen could hear Rodriguez typing rapidly, presumably sending messages that would soon reach someone with the authority to turn this entire situation upside down. He looked out the window again, watching more people arrive for what was supposed to be a routine graduation ceremony. In the auditorium, Captain Reeves had approached the protocol officer and was speaking quietly but urgently. Laura couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the ensign's expression change from uncertainty to something approaching alarm. He looked at his tablet, then at Laura, then back at the captain. "Ma'am," Captain Reeves said, approaching Laura's row, "I'm going to have to ask for your patience while we sort out some administrative issues. It appears there may have been some significant oversights in how your records were handled." Laura studied the captain's face, looking for clues about what was coming. Military bearing was hard to fake, and Captain Reeves carried himself like someone who'd seen enough service to recognize it in others, regardless of their current occupation or circumstances. "What kind of oversights?" she asked. "The kind that require attention from someone with higher authority than anyone currently in this building," Reeves replied carefully. "Ma'am, would you be willing to wait while we contact the appropriate personnel?" Around them, the auditorium was filling with family members and friends of the graduating class. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 30 minutes, but Laura could sense that the normal schedule was about to be disrupted in ways none of these people had anticipated. Lieutenant Reddick made one last attempt to assert control over the situation. "Captain, I'm sure we can resolve this without involving—" "Lieutenant," Captain Reeves said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority, "I suggest you find something else to occupy your attention. This situation is now above your pay grade." The rebuke was delivered quietly, but it carried clearly enough for nearby attendees to hear. Phones appeared throughout the auditorium as people sensed that they were witnessing something significant. Though few could have guessed the real scope of what was unfolding, Owen emerged from the administrative building, walking quickly across the courtyard toward the auditorium. In his hand, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed a number from Quantico, Virginia. Colonel Evan Coulter was apparently a man who didn't waste time. "This is Brackett," Owen answered as he reached the auditorium entrance. "Owen, this is Colonel Coulter. I understand you've got someone there who might be one of my people from Echo 12. The voice was crisp, authoritative, and carried undertones that suggested this conversation was about to change everything for everyone involved. "Yes, sir," Owen replied. "Laura Hensley, she's being hassled by a lieutenant who thinks she doesn't belong at a military ceremony." "Laura Hensley," Coulter repeated, and Owen could hear something change in the colonel's voice. Recognition, maybe, or something deeper. Jesus, where exactly is she right now? Main auditorium, surrounded by people with cameras, being treated like she's some kind of security risk. The pause that followed lasted long enough for Owen to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Colonel Coulter spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Owen straighten unconsciously. "I'm 40 minutes out. Do not let anyone remove that woman from that building. Do not let anyone intimidate her into leaving voluntarily. And tell whoever's in charge there that if Laura Hensley is harmed or humiliated further, they'll be answering to me personally." The line went dead, leaving Owen staring at his phone in the parking lot outside an auditorium, where a woman who'd apparently saved 18 lives was being treated like an unwelcome intruder. 40 minutes until Colonel Coulter arrived. 40 minutes until Lieutenant Reddick learned exactly how wrong he'd been about Laura Hensley. Owen looked through the auditorium windows and could see Laura still sitting in her seat, still maintaining the composed dignity that had carried her through what was apparently 15 years of unrecognized service. Around her, the crowd continued to build, unaware that they were about to witness something that would challenge every assumption they'd made about who belonged in their midst. The graduation ceremony was definitely not going to proceed as planned. The auditorium doors opened with the kind of authority that made conversations stop mid-sentence. Colonel Evan Coulter stepped into the room, and even people who didn't know military protocol could sense that someone significant had arrived. He moved down the center aisle with the measured pace of a man who'd never had to explain his presence anywhere. His dress blue uniform immaculate, his bearing suggesting decades of command responsibility. Laura felt her breath catch as she recognized him. 15 years older, more silver in his hair, but unmistakably the same officer who'd coordinated their extraction from that hellish compound in 2009. The man who'd looked her in the eye as they'd loaded the wounded onto the helicopter and said simply, "We don't leave people behind." Now he was here, in a Florida Training Center's auditorium. Walking directly toward her while 300 people watched in growing silence, Lieutenant Reddick, who'd been holding court near the side wall, took an involuntary step backward as the colonel passed. Whatever confidence he'd maintained throughout this confrontation evaporated as he took in the significance of the rank insignia, the combat ribbons, the bearing of someone who'd commanded troops in actual combat zones. Colonel Coulter reached Laura's row and stopped, turning to face the crowd that had fallen completely silent. In his left hand, he carried an olive-green folder that looked both official and carefully preserved. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the room without amplification. Mrs. Hensley. Her name sounded different in his voice. Not casual, not dismissive, but weighted with recognition that made several people in the nearby rows lean forward. "My name is Evan Coulter. Echo 12 wasn't just a call sign. It was the reason some of us made it home." He opened the folder with deliberate precision, and Laura could see photographs inside. Black and white images she recognized, despite the years that had passed. Her own face, 15 years younger, stared back from what looked like an official unit photograph. 18 faces arranged in 2 rows, all of them looking tired but determined, all of them carrying the invisible weight of what they'd just survived. "Operation Warden 3, Colonel Coulter continued, his voice never changing volume but somehow filling every corner of the auditorium. "Classified mission. Executed in hostile territory under deteriorating conditions. 18 personnel extracted with 0 casualties despite equipment failure, communications breakdown, and 16 hours of intermittent contact with hostile forces." Around the room, phones had appeared, but they were recording now with a different kind of attention. This wasn't viral content about someone being humiliated. This was something else entirely, something that felt historically significant. Coulter pulled out a document, official letterhead partially visible, most of the text blacked out with redaction marks, but with several sections highlighted in yellow. Laura couldn't read it from where she sat, but she could guess what it contained. "The communications specialist assigned to Echo 12, he read, his voice carrying the weight of official record. "Maintained operational contact under extreme conditions. Executing field repairs to critical equipment while under direct fire. Without this individual's technical expertise and personal courage, the mission would have resulted in total loss of personnel." Laura felt Tyler's eyes on her from somewhere in the staging area where the graduating class was supposedly preparing for their ceremony. Her son, who'd grown up hearing generic references to her communications work in the military, was learning for the first time what that had actually meant. Lieutenant Reddick tried to salvage something from the situation, stepping forward with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was beginning to understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there during his earlier confrontations with Laura, "I was just following standard security protocols. We have to verify that all attendees have proper authorization to—" "Lieutenant," Colonel Coulter's voice cut through Reddick's explanation like a blade. "Did you verify Mrs. Hensley's authorization to attend this ceremony?" "Well, no, sir, but the seating appeared to be—" "Did you review her military service record before deciding she didn't belong here?" Reddick's face had gone pale. "No, sir. I just assumed that since she didn't have the usual identification that—" "You assumed." Coulter repeated the words with the kind of deadly calm that made experienced soldiers check their gear and review their procedures. "Based on what, Lieutenant? Her appearance, her age? The fact that she doesn't match your narrow conception of what a veteran looks like." Around the auditorium, the silence had become absolute, Even the air conditioning seemed to hum more quietly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Colonel Coulter turned back to Laura, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something she hadn't heard directed at her in 15 years. Recognition, respect, and what sounded like personal gratitude. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "you've been carrying that challenge coin for a long time. The Echo 12 coin that you thought no one would recognize, that you kept hidden because you believed your service had been forgotten." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "I want you to know that some of us never forgot. Some of us have been waiting 15 years for the right moment to say what should have been said in 2009. He reached into the folder again and withdrew what looked like a citation, official military stationery with multiple signatures and an embossed seal. Echo 12 operated outside standard command structures due to the sensitive nature of the mission parameters. When the unit was disbanded, official recognition was delayed due to ongoing classification requirements and operational security concerns. Captain Reeves appeared at Colonel Coulter's shoulder, carrying what looked like additional documentation. Behind him, Owen Brackett stood with several other veterans who'd materialized from various corners of the base, people who'd clearly been making phone calls and following developments with growing interest. "The delay," Coulter continued, "became an oversight, the oversight became an injustice, and the injustice continued until today, when a woman who risked her life to save 18 soldiers was treated like an intruder at a military ceremony." He looked directly at Lieutenant Reddick, who was now standing perfectly still with the kind of rigid attention that suggested he was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his error. "Lieutenant Reddick," Coulter said, his voice carrying the authority of rank but also something more personal, disappointment, perhaps, or the kind of anger that came from seeing institutional failures played out in individual cruelty. "Would you like to explain to this audience why you felt qualified to determine who deserves recognition for their military service?" Reddick opened his mouth, then closed it, apparently realizing that no answer he could give would improve his situation. Around the auditorium, the families and friends who'd come to celebrate their graduates' achievements were witnessing something none of them had expected, a reckoning with institutional assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. "Ms. Hensley," Colonel Coulter said, turning back to Laura, "I owe you an apology on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, and every institution that should have recognized your service years ago." He paused, and Laura could see something personal in his expression, something that went beyond official duty. "But more than that, I owe you a debt that's 15 years overdue. My Marines and I wouldn't have made it home without you." The families represented in this room today, some of them owe their fathers, their sons, their brothers to the work you did in that bunker while mortars were falling around us. Laura felt tears threatening for the first time all day, but they weren't tears of humiliation or frustration. They were something else entirely. Relief, maybe, or recognition, or simply the overwhelming sensation of having her truth acknowledged after 15 years of careful silence. Tyler appeared at the edge of her vision, having somehow made his way from the staging area to the main auditorium. He stood near the side wall, still in his graduation uniform, watching his mother receive recognition that was 15 years overdue. Colonel Coulter noticed Tyler's presence and nodded toward him. "Your son's graduation ceremony is going to be delayed," he told Laura, "because today we're going to correct an injustice that never should have been allowed to stand this long." He gestured toward the exit, where Laura could see officials preparing what looked like a more formal setting in an adjacent room. "Ma'am, would you please accompany me? It's time to make this official." As Laura stood, the entire auditorium erupted in applause, not the polite appreciation usually reserved for guest speakers, but something deeper and more personal. These people were witnessing the restoration of honor to someone who'd carried its absence for far too long. Lieutenant Reddick remained standing at rigid attention, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by the growing realization that his career had just taken a turn that would require significant damage control and possibly formal review. But Laura was no longer thinking about Lieutenant Reddick. She was following Colonel Coulter toward a room where her 15 years of silence were about to become something else entirely. A story that could finally be told, recognition that could finally be claimed, and a truth that could finally see daylight. The honor room adjacent to the main auditorium had been transformed in the 20 minutes since Colonel Coulter's arrival. Military efficiency was on full display. Someone had arranged additional seating, positioned cameras for an official record, and assembled what looked like the beginnings of a formal recognition ceremony. Laura found herself at the center of it all, still somewhat stunned by the speed with which her carefully constructed anonymity had dissolved. Captain Reeves stood at a portable podium that had materialized from somewhere in the base's inventory, reading from a tablet, while other officials arranged documents on a side table. The formality felt surreal after years of deflecting questions about her military service, of carefully editing her past to avoid explanations she couldn't provide. Before we proceed with the official recognition, Colonel Coulter announced to the assembled crowd that had followed them from the main auditorium, "I want to ensure that everyone understands the significance of what we're addressing today." He gestured toward a display that had been hastily arranged on an easel, enlarged photographs from the Echo 12 unit files, maps that had been cleared for public viewing, and official documentation that 15 years ago would have required security clearances to examine. Operation Warden 3 was designated as a classified rescue mission due to the sensitive nature of the terrain and the diplomatic implications of our presence in the region, Coulter explained. 18 personnel from multiple branches were tasked with extracting high-value assets under deteriorating conditions. Laura watched Tyler move through the crowd to get closer, his expression reflecting the kind of intense attention she remembered from his childhood, when he was trying to understand something that seemed just beyond his comprehension. For 15 years, she'd deflected his questions about her military service. Now he was learning the answers in the most public way possible. The mission parameters changed approximately 6 hours after insertion, Coulter continued. What was supposed to be a routine extraction became a prolonged defensive operation when hostile forces surrounded the compound, and our primary communications equipment was damaged by mortar fire. Captain Reeves looked up from his tablet. "Sir, we have confirmation from Naval Special Warfare Command that all relevant security classifications have been lifted for the portions of the operation pertaining to Ms. Hensley's service record." Colonel Coulter nodded. Ms. Hensley served as the senior communications specialist for Echo 12 when our radio array was destroyed. She spent 16 hours in a partially collapsed communications bunker, rebuilding the equipment that allowed us to coordinate our extraction. He paused, looking directly at Laura. Those 16 hours were under intermittent fire. The bunker she was working in took 3 direct hits from mortar rounds. She had multiple opportunities to evacuate to safer positions, but she refused to leave until communications were fully operational. Around the room, the murmur of conversation had stopped completely. Laura could feel every eye on her as Colonel Coulter described actions that had felt, at the time, like simply doing her job under difficult circumstances. The perspective of 15 years and official recognition was making those actions feel much more significant than they had in the moment. The result of Mrs. Hensley's technical expertise and personal courage, Coulter said, was 0 casualties during a mission that could have resulted in total loss of personnel. 18 people came home because she refused to give up on equipment that most people would have declared irreparable. Lieutenant Reddick was visible near the back of the room, standing at rigid attention with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he was still processing the magnitude of his earlier behavior. Several senior officers had positioned themselves near him, not quite a formal review, but clearly the beginning of a conversation that would have significant implications for his career. Owen Brackett approached the podium with something in his hands, Laura's original Echo 12 challenge coin, but now accompanied by official documentation that she'd never seen before. "Ms. Hensley," Owen said, "I believe this belongs to you, the official version, with the commendations that should have been presented 15 years ago." He opened a presentation case to reveal not just the challenge coin, but a complete set of documentation, her actual service record, previously classified performance evaluations, and what looked like recommendations for formal recognition that had been submitted but never processed. Colonel Coulter took the case and approached Laura. "The Military Outstanding Volunteer Service Medal," he announced, "recognizing exceptional voluntary service that results in tangible benefit to the military community." He paused. "Along with the Combat Action Badge, which was somehow omitted from your discharge paperwork." As he pinned the medals to Laura's jacket, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years. the weight of official recognition for actions that had shaped her entire adult life but could never be acknowledged. Tyler was recording with his phone, documenting a moment that would finally give him the complete story of his mother's service. "There's something else," Colonel Coulter said, returning to the podium. "The Department of Defense has been conducting a systematic review of veterans whose service remained classified beyond operational necessity. Miss Hensley's case has been identified as part of a broader pattern of recognition, delayed far beyond reasonable security requirements." Captain Reeves stepped forward with additional documentation. "We're prepared to offer formal reinstatement of Miss Hensley's complete military record, including all previously classified commendations and performance evaluations. Additionally, we're prepared to provide full access to veteran benefits that may have been limited due to classification issues." Laura looked around the room at faces that had shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. These people had come to attend a routine graduation ceremony and instead found themselves witnessing the restoration of honor to someone they'd initially seen as an intruder, but it was Tyler's expression that meant the most to her, pride mixed with understanding, as if pieces of his childhood were suddenly making sense. All those times she'd deflected questions about her nightmares, her tendency to sleep lightly, her automatic assessment of exits and escape routes, all the careful editing she'd done when discussing her military service, the generic references that had never quite satisfied his curiosity. "Ma'am," Colonel Coulter said, "would you like to say something?" Laura looked out at the assembled crowd, base personnel, family members of graduating students, fellow veterans who'd materialized from various corners of the installation. 15 years ago, she'd left military service with a handshake and a generic thank you letter. Today, she was being asked to speak publicly about experiences that had been classified for longer than her son had been alive. "I want to thank Colonel Coulter and everyone who made today possible," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "But I also want to say something about Lieutenant Reddick." The room fell completely silent. Reddick himself straightened, clearly uncertain about what was coming. 15 years ago, "I would have made the same assumptions he made today," Laura said. "I would have looked at someone like me, a single mother with a maintenance job and an old camera, and I would have questioned whether they belonged at a military ceremony." She paused, looking directly at Reddick. "The difference is, I've learned something in the years since my discharge. I've learned that service takes many forms, that courage doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that some of the most significant contributions come from people who don't fit our preconceptions." Reddick's expression had shifted from apprehension to something approaching gratitude for what sounded like forgiveness, rather than condemnation. "I hope," Laura continued, "that today serves as a reminder that we all carry invisible histories, that the person sitting next to you at any ceremony, any gathering, any ordinary moment, might have extraordinary stories that they've been unable to tell." The applause that followed was different from the earlier recognition, warmer, more personal, acknowledging not just her service but her grace in handling circumstances that could have justifiably resulted in anger and resentment. Colonel Coulter approached her one final time. "Miss Hensley, there's one more thing. We're establishing a new protocol for reviewing cases of delayed recognition due to classification issues. We'd like you to serve as an advisor for that process." Laura looked around the room one more time, at Tyler beaming with pride, at Owen Brackett nodding approvingly, at the faces of people who'd witnessed the transformation of assumptions into understanding. For the first time in 15 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Laura had ever experienced. They moved to the center's formal honor room, a space she'd never imagined she'd enter, with polished oak panels that gleamed under soft lighting and display cases filled with decades of military history. The American flag stood proudly in one corner, while the Navy's colors occupied another. Everything in the room spoke of tradition, honor, and recognition, earned through sacrifice. Colonel Coulter positioned himself at a mahogany podium that had clearly seen countless such moments. Behind him, base officials arranged themselves in precise formation. Captain Reeves, the protocol officer who'd tried to remove Laura earlier, and several others whose ranks she couldn't immediately identify. Someone had brought in additional chairs, transforming what might have been a simple administrative meeting into something approaching a formal ceremony. Laura found herself standing at the center of it all, Tyler beside her in his graduation uniform, both of them still processing the surreal turn their day had taken. Her son's eyes kept moving between her face and the official documents being arranged on a side table, as if he were trying to reconcile the mother he'd known his entire life with the woman these officers seemed to recognize. "Before we proceed with the formal recognition," Colonel Coulter began, his voice carrying the weight of authority but tinged with something more personal, "I want to explain why this matters, not just to Miss Hensley, but to everyone who's ever served in the shadows." He gestured toward the display cases around them. "Every medal, every commendation you see in this room tells a story. Most of those stories are public, battles fought in known wars, heroism witnessed by many, but some stories remain classified long after the operations themselves are finished. Some people carry their service in silence, not because they're ashamed, but because they were ordered to." Laura's hands trembled slightly as she listened. 15 years of careful silence, of deflecting questions about her past, of watching her son wonder why his mother seemed so removed from the military community that surrounded their lives near every base where they'd lived. "Operation Warden 3 was one of those stories," Coulter continued. 18 personnel trapped in hostile territory, radio equipment damaged, standard extraction protocols compromised. What should have been a routine mission became a 16-hour nightmare that tested every person involved. He paused, looking directly at Laura. "Ms. Hensley was our communications specialist. When our primary radio array was damaged by mortar fire, she spent 6 hours in a partially collapsed bunker, rebuilding circuits by hand while under intermittent fire. Without her work, we wouldn't have been able to coordinate the extraction. 18 people came home because she refused to give up." Tyler's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. Laura felt his eyes on her, but she couldn't look at him yet. The memories Coulter was evoking were still too raw, too immediate. The smell of cordite and concrete dust, the weight of tools in her hands as explosions shook the building around her. The absolute certainty that if she failed, people would die. "The unit was disbanded 6 months later," Coulter said. "Official records were sealed due to ongoing security concerns in the region. Awards and recognition were postponed indefinitely. Ms. Hensley received an honorable discharge and a handshake. That was all." Captain Reeves stepped forward with a document case, his earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching solemnity. Inside, Laura could see official letterhead, multiple signatures, and several seals she recognized. "The Medal for Distinguished Service in Classified Operations," Coulter announced, lifting a presentation case from the table. The medal inside was smaller than Laura had expected, a simple bronze star with silver accents, suspended from a ribbon in deep blue with thin silver stripes. "Awarded for exceptional courage and technical expertise during Operation Warden 3, in service to personnel extraction under hostile conditions." As he approached her, Laura found herself standing straighter, military posture, ingrained through years of training she'd tried to forget, reasserted itself. Tyler noticed the change immediately. Suddenly his mother looked like a soldier again, like someone who belonged in this room full of uniforms and ceremony. "Ms. Hensley," Coulter said, pinning the medal to her jacket. "For decades, some have done the invisible work that keeps the visible heroes alive. Today, we acknowledge that courage. Today, we say that service in the shadows still deserves recognition." The applause started with Owen Brackett, who'd somehow materialized near the back of the room. It built slowly as others joined in. The base officials, Tyler's classmates who'd followed the drama from the auditorium, even some of the family members who'd been attending the original graduation ceremony. Laura looked out at the faces surrounding her, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from invisibility to recognition. Then she saw Lieutenant Reddick standing near the doorway, his earlier arrogance completely absent. When their eyes met across the room, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate and formal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I owe you an apology. A public one." He paused, and Laura could see him struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I made assumptions based on nothing, on prejudice, on my own narrow view of what service looks like." Another pause. "You deserved better from me, from this institution, from everyone who should have recognized your sacrifice years ago. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I'm deeply sorry." The room fell silent again. Laura studied the young officer's face, seeing genuine remorse there, but also something else, a kind of education happening in real time. She nodded slowly, accepting the apology with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said simply. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Owen Brackett approached with something in his hands, the Echo 12 challenge coin, but now it was in an official presentation case, complete with documentation and a small brass nameplate. "This belongs to you," he said, setting it on the table before her. "Officially this time, no more hiding it in your purse." Around them, other members of Echo 12 had begun to appear, faces Laura recognized despite the years that had passed. Marcus Webb, the demolitions expert whose steady hands had defused 3 IEDs during the extraction. Sarah Chen, the medic who'd kept 2 wounded soldiers alive through that endless night. David Rodriguez, their squad leader, who'd made the decision to stay and fight instead of attempting a running retreat that would have gotten them all killed. They moved through the room quietly, exchanging handshakes and brief words with Laura. No long speeches, no dramatic reunions, just the acknowledgement of shared experience, of bonds forged under circumstances most people would never understand. "There's something else," Coulter said, pulling out another folder as the informal reunions continued around them. "The Department of Defense is forming a new consulting council. Veterans whose service remained classified. People who understand the unique challenges of carrying secrets for the greater good." He looked at Laura steadily. "We'd like you to be part of it. Help us identify others who've been overlooked. Develop protocols for recognition that don't compromise ongoing operations." Laura turned the challenge coin over in her hands, feeling its familiar weight but seeing it differently now. For 15 years, it had been a reminder of something she couldn't claim, couldn't explain, couldn't share with the person who mattered most to her. Now it was proof that she'd never been invisible after all, just waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. Tyler leaned close to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, were you really a hero this whole time?" Laura looked at her son, this young man who'd grown up watching her work as a maintenance technician, who'd never questioned why she sometimes woke up from nightmares she couldn't explain, who'd accepted her reluctance to talk about her military service without pushing for details she couldn't give. "Not a hero," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Just someone who did her job when it mattered. Just someone who didn't give up when giving up would have meant losing people I cared about." The formal ceremony was winding down, but the conversations continued. Laura found herself at the center of something she'd never expected. A community of people who understood exactly what she'd been carrying all these years. The setting sun painted the mess hall in warm golden light as the impromptu reception continued around hastily rearranged tables. Someone had brought coffee and what looked like leftover cake from another event, transforming the utilitarian space into something approaching festive. Laura sat at a table near the windows, still wearing her medal. Tyler on one side and Colonel Coulter across from her, the formal ceremony having given way to something more intimate and personal. "I need you to understand something," Coulter said, leaning forward slightly, his voice quiet enough that only Laura and Tyler could hear. "What happened to you? The way your service was buried, forgotten. It wasn't unique. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of veterans carrying similar secrets. People who did extraordinary things in classified operations and then disappeared back into civilian life with nothing to show for it." Laura traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger, thinking of all the times she'd sat in rooms like this, listening to other veterans share stories she could never match with her own, the careful way she'd learned to deflect questions about her deployment, the isolation of carrying experiences that couldn't be shared. "Why now?" she asked. "Why bring this to light after 15 years? Coulter glanced around the room where small groups of people continued to talk in low voices. Some were Echo 12 veterans, others were current base personnel who'd witnessed the day's events. A few were Tyler's fellow graduates who'd found themselves part of something much larger than their own ceremony. "Because times have changed," he said. "The operational security concerns that kept Echo 12 classified are no longer relevant. The region has stabilized. The tactics we used are outdated and, frankly, the secrecy was doing more harm than good." He paused, meeting Laura's eyes. "But mostly because Lieutenant Reddick isn't the only person who's made assumptions about veterans who don't fit the traditional mold." Tyler had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. What do you mean? Coulter turned to include him in the conversation. Your mother spent years working as a maintenance technician after her discharge. Good work, honest work, but it didn't exactly scream decorated veteran. People saw what they expected to see. A single mother doing her best to get by. They didn't see someone who'd risked her life to save 18 soldiers. I saw it sometimes, Tyler said quietly. The way you'd check exits when we entered new places, how you always sat with your back to the wall, the nightmares you thought I didn't know about. He looked at his mother with new understanding. I just didn't know what it meant. Laura felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For years, she'd worried that her careful silence was creating distance between her and her son, that her inability to explain her past was somehow failing him as a parent. Now, hearing him acknowledge what he'd observed, she realized he'd been more aware than she'd given him credit for. Owen Brackett approached their table with Sarah Chen at his side. Both carried coffee cups and the kind of relaxed expressions that came after years of wondering if they'd ever be able to talk openly about their shared experience. Mind if we join you? Sarah asked. She'd aged well, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her posture still carrying the confidence that had made her such an effective combat medic. It's been a long time since we could sit in the open and talk about Warden 3. They settled into chairs around the table. And suddenly Laura found herself part of a conversation she'd been imagining for 15 years. The details were still classified, but the feelings, the impact, the way the experience had shaped all of their subsequent lives, that could finally be shared. I became a nurse practitioner, Sarah said, responding to Tyler's question about what everyone had done after discharge. Spent 10 years in emergency rooms, then moved into trauma surgery. Couldn't shake the feeling that there were always people who needed help. Security consulting, Owen added, mostly corporate stuff, but it paid the bills. Never could get back to feeling completely safe in one place. You know, had to keep moving. Laura nodded, understanding completely. She'd changed jobs 7 times in the first 5 years after discharge, always finding reasons to relocate, always searching for something she couldn't quite name. It had taken becoming a mother to finally give her a reason to stay in one place long enough to build a life. The hardest part, she said, was not being able to explain why normal things felt so complicated. Job interviews where they'd ask about my military experience, and all I could say was, communications specialist, without any of the context that made it meaningful. Colonel Coulter had been listening to the conversation, but now he leaned forward. That's exactly why this consulting council matters. You've all spent years adapting to civilian life without the support systems most veterans have. No unit reunions, no shared stories, no community of people who understood what you'd been through. He pulled out a tablet and showed them what looked like an organizational chart. We're proposing a formal program, identification and outreach to veterans of classified operations, counseling services that can work within security constraints, and most importantly, a pathway to recognition that doesn't compromise ongoing security needs. Tyler studied the chart over Laura's shoulder. How many people are we talking about? More than you'd think, Coulter replied. Special operations have been expanding for decades. Most of it stays in the public record. But some missions, some units, some operations get buried for various reasons. Security concerns, diplomatic complications, or sometimes just bureaucratic oversight. He gestured around the table. Echo 12 got lost in the shuffle when the unit was disbanded. Your mother's records got filed under routine deployment because someone thought it was easier than dealing with the classification issues. Laura felt a flash of the old anger at that. 15 years of carrying the weight of what she'd done, what they'd all done, dismissed as bureaucratic convenience, but it was tempered now by the presence of people who understood, and by the possibility that her experience might prevent others from facing the same isolation. What would you need from me? She asked. Your story. Coulter said simply, your perspective on what it's like to carry classified service alone, your insights into how we can do better for the next generation of veterans who find themselves in similar situations. He paused. And your willingness to help us find others who've been overlooked. Around them, the reception was beginning to wind down. Tyler's classmates were starting to leave, their own families gathering for private celebrations of their graduation. The Echo 12 veterans were exchanging contact information, phone numbers and email addresses that could finally be shared openly, Laura looked around the table at these people who'd been scattered across the country for 15 years, each carrying their piece of a shared experience in isolation. Now they were together again, no longer bound by secrecy, free to acknowledge what they'd accomplished and what they'd sacrificed. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, reaching into her purse and pulling out something Laura recognized immediately. Another challenge coin, but this one was different, newer, with a design that incorporated elements from Echo 12 but added something extra. "We've been talking, those of us who stayed in touch, about creating something official for the unit. A memorial of sorts." She handed the coin to Laura. The face showed the familiar trident and coordinates, but the reverse had been updated with the dates of Operation Warden 3 and the names of all 18 personnel who'd been extracted. At the bottom, in small letters, it read, "Service in Shadows, Honor in Light." Tyler leaned over to examine the coin. "That's beautiful," he said. "And it's got your name on it, Mom, all of your names." Laura felt tears threatening for the first time all day. Not the tears of frustration and isolation she'd shed privately over the years, but something different. Relief, maybe, or recognition, or simply the overwhelming sensation of no longer being alone with her memories. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely steady. "All of you. For 15 years I've wondered if what we did mattered to anyone besides us today. Today, I know it did." Colonel Coulter stood, checking his watch. "I hate to break this up, but I know you all have families waiting. But this isn't the end of the conversation. Mrs. Hensley, I'll have someone from the council program contact you next week. We'll start with a formal interview about your experience, then see where it leads." As the group began to disperse, Tyler turned to his mother. "Are you ready for this, being public about your service again?" Laura considered the question, feeling the weight of both challenge coins in her pockets, the medal still pinned to her jacket. For 15 years, she'd been someone who used to be a soldier. Now, maybe, she could be a veteran again, with all the responsibilities and opportunities that came with that identity. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm ready to stop carrying this alone. And if that helps other people in the same situation." She looked around the mess hall one more time, at the place where her carefully constructed privacy had been replaced by unexpected recognition. "Then yes, I'm ready." The parking lot was nearly empty as Laura and Tyler made their way toward her car, the base settling into its evening routine around them. Security lights were beginning to flicker on, and she could hear the distant sound of evening colors being played over the base's loudspeaker system. It was a sound that had once been the rhythm of her daily life, and now it felt like a welcome back to a world she'd thought was closed to her forever. Tyler walked beside her in comfortable silence, still processing the day's revelations. Occasionally, she'd catch him glancing at her with a new kind of curiosity, as if he were seeing her for the first time. The metal caught the parking lot lights as they walked, and she found herself touching it unconsciously, still amazed that it was really there. "Mom," Tyler said as they reached the car, "can I ask you something?" Laura leaned against the driver's side door, feeling suddenly exhausted but also strangely energized. "Of course. All those times growing up when I'd ask about your military service, and you'd change the subject." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Were you protecting me, or protecting yourself?" The question hit deeper than Laura had expected. She'd told herself for years that her silence was about security protocols, about classified information that couldn't be shared. But standing here in the parking lot, with the day's events still fresh in her mind, she could finally be honest about the more complicated truth. "Both," she said. "The official answer is that I couldn't talk about classified operations. But the real answer is that I didn't know how to explain why I'd left all of that behind to become someone ordinary." Tyler frowned. "Ordinary, Mom? You've never been ordinary." Laura smiled, thinking of all the ways her son had seen through her careful attempts at normalcy over the years. "I spent 15 years trying to be ordinary, working regular jobs, living in regular neighborhoods, being just another single mom trying to raise her kid, right?" She looked across the parking lot toward the buildings where her old life had just collided with her new one. "I convinced myself that was enough, that being your mother was enough." "It was enough," Tyler said firmly. "But it wasn't all you were, was it?" Before Laura could answer, she heard footsteps approaching across the asphalt. Colonel Coulter was walking toward them, no longer in official mode, but still carrying the bearing that had commanded attention in the honor room earlier. "Ms. Hensley," he called out as he approached. "I hope you don't mind the interruption. There's something I wanted to say privately, away from all the ceremony and official business." Laura straightened, not sure what to expect. The colonel's expression was serious, but not in the formal way it had been earlier. This looked more personal. "What you did today," he began, "standing your ground when that lieutenant tried to humiliate you, refusing to disappear when it would have been easier. That took the same kind of courage you showed in that bunker 15 years ago." He glanced at Tyler, then back to Laura. "A lot of people would have taken the easy way out, let him move you to a different seat, avoided the confrontation, gone home with their dignity intact and their secrets still buried. You chose differently." Laura thought about that moment in the auditorium, when Lieutenant Reddick had offered her the simple solution of admitting fault to make the problem disappear. It would have been so easy to accept the blame, to shuffle out of the room and let everyone return to their assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. "I almost did take the easy way," she admitted. "For about 30 seconds. I considered it. But then I thought about Tyler, about what it would mean for him to watch his mother accept blame for something that wasn't her fault. And I thought about all the other people who might be in similar situations, who might need someone to show that it's possible to stand your ground." Colonel Coulter nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need on the Consulting Council. People who understand that individual courage can create institutional change." Tyler had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. "That's why this matters so much, isn't it? It's not just about recognizing what happened in the past. It's about preventing future injustices." "Exactly," Coulter replied. "Every veteran who gets overlooked, every person who gets dismissed because they don't fit someone's narrow definition of what military service looks like. They deserve better, and the only way to create that change is to acknowledge the problem and work systematically to fix it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Laura. "My direct number, when you're ready to start working with the council. Call me. We'll begin with your story, but I suspect it won't end there. Someone with your integrity and your perspective could help reshape how we think about recognition and support for classified veterans." As the colonel walked away, Laura and Tyler got into the car. She started the engine but didn't immediately put it in gear, instead sitting quietly and letting the day's events settle in her mind. The parking lot around them was almost empty now. Just a few scattered vehicles belonging to night shift personnel and late workers. "So what happens now?" Tyler asked, echoing the question he'd posed earlier, but with a deeper understanding of its implications. Laura considered this as she watched a security patrol vehicle make its rounds in the distance. "Now I go home and figure out how to be myself again, the real version of myself, not the carefully edited version I've been presenting for 15 years. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the contacts until she found the number for Maria Santos, her supervisor at the contracting company where she'd been working for the past 3 years. Maria had always been supportive, but she'd also made it clear that she thought Laura was overqualified for the work she was doing. "I need to make a phone call tomorrow," Laura said. "Tell my boss that I might be taking on some consulting work that's more in line with my background." Tyler grinned. "Think she'll be surprised. I think she's going to say, 'I knew there was more to your story,'" Laura replied. "Maria's good at reading people. She probably figured out years ago that I wasn't telling her everything about my military service." As they drove off the base, Tyler turned to look back at the building silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Do you think you'll miss it being anonymous, I mean?" Laura thought about this as they passed through the gate, returning the guard's salute automatically, a gesture that felt natural again for the first time in years. "I'll miss the simplicity of it," she said. "There's something peaceful about being able to fly under the radar, to be just another face in the crowd." She paused, thinking about the weight of responsibility that came with stepping back into public recognition. "But I won't miss the isolation. I won't miss feeling like I have to hide parts of myself to fit in. And I definitely won't miss watching other people go through what I went through, knowing I could help, but feeling like I couldn't speak up." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar route home taking them through neighborhoods where Laura had built her civilian life, past the grocery store where she shopped every week, the library where Tyler had spent countless hours as a child, the park where they'd had picnics and played catch and built the ordinary, precious memories that had sustained them both. "You know what I keep thinking about," Tyler said as they pulled into their driveway. "All those times when I was younger, when other kids would talk about their parents' military service, and I felt like I didn't have those kinds of stories to share." Laura turned off the engine, leaving them sitting in the gathering darkness. "I'm sorry about that. I never wanted you to feel left out." "I'm not complaining," Tyler said quickly. It's strange to realize that I actually did have those stories. Better stories than most, probably. I just didn't know it." They sat together in the car for a few more minutes, both reluctant to go inside and end this extraordinary day. Laura reached into her pocket and pulled out the Echo 12 challenge coin. Now, in its official presentation case, in the dim light from the dashboard, she could just make out the inscription on the new version. "Service in shadows, honor in light. I've been carrying the old one for 15 years, she said, showing Tyler both coins. "Every day, everywhere I went, it was like a secret reminder of who I used to be before I became your mom." Tyler examined both coins carefully. "Can I ask you something else?" "Always. Are you nervous?" "About working with this consulting council, about helping other veterans." Laura considered the question seriously. Tomorrow, there would be phone calls and meetings and the beginning of a new chapter she'd never expected to write. There would be interviews where she'd have to revisit memories she'd spent years trying to compartmentalize. There would be responsibility for helping shape policies that could affect thousands of veterans she'd never meet. "Terrified," she said honestly, "but also excited for the first time in 15 years. I have the chance to use everything I learned, everything I experienced, to help people, not just technical skills, but understanding what it's like to carry invisible burdens." She looked at her son, this young man who'd grown up watching her navigate the complicated space between her past and present, who'd learned to read the signs of her hidden struggles without ever demanding explanations she couldn't give. "And I have you," she added, "someone who's seen both versions of me and somehow managed to grow up into an incredible person despite having a mother who was keeping significant secrets." Tyler reached over and hugged her, a gesture that seemed to encompass everything they'd both learned about each other today. "I'm proud of you, Mom, not just for what you did back then, but for choosing to step forward today instead of disappearing, for being willing to help other people even when it would be easier to just enjoy your own recognition quietly." As they finally went inside, Laura found herself thinking about all the veterans who might be out there carrying their own challenge coins in secret, their own memories of service that couldn't be shared, their own struggles with the gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. Tomorrow, she'd begin the work of finding them, of creating pathways for recognition that didn't require public humiliation to activate. It wouldn't be easy work. There would be bureaucratic obstacles, security concerns, and the complex challenge of balancing individual needs with institutional requirements. But for the first time in 15 years, Laura felt like she was moving towards something instead of away from it. She placed both challenge coins on her dresser, side by side, the worn one that had carried her through years of silence, and the new one that represented the possibility of speaking openly about experiences that had shaped her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Outside her window, she could see lights coming on in houses throughout the neighborhood, families settling in for the evening, people going about their ordinary lives while carrying their own invisible histories. Some of those people were veterans, she knew. Some of them were probably carrying secrets similar to her own, but after today, maybe they wouldn't have to carry them alone for quite so long in the grand sweep of military history. One incident at one training center might seem insignificant, but every act of courage, whether on a battlefield or in an auditorium, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Sometimes the most important victories are won not with weapons, but with the simple decision to stand your ground, when standing up means others might find the courage to do the same. Would you like another story?